Hello and welcome to the first ever latest report. I will be bringing you the latest in news, culture and the arts from my own perspective, my own little YouTube diary. We are the future, the online generation, and the days where we only knew what the government wanted us to know are over. We all now have the power of instant connection with people thousands of miles away, and a tidal wave of information previous generations would have had no access to has washed over us. I'll be sharing it all, and invite any comments, good or bad. I'm human like everyone else. If you disagree with me or I make a mistake, please let me know. There are as many opinions in the world as there are people. In the digital age, the future is now. Before that, let's address the past, with a summary of the rise of the rulers of our universe, or so they would have you believe. The wankers with a B, otherwise known as the money changers. Let's go all the way back to 48 CC, and someone else who was afforded godlike status, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar took back from the money changers the power to coin money, and then minted coins for the benefit of all. With this new plentiful money supply, he established many massive construction projects and built great public works. By making money plentiful, Caesar won the love of the common people. But the money changers hated him for it, and this is why Caesar was assassinated. Immediately after his assassination came the demise of plentiful money in Rome. Taxes increased, as did corruption. Eventually the Roman money supply was reduced by 90%, which resulted in the common people losing their lands and homes. Funnily enough, it still continues. Let's go to 30 AD and a gentleman by the name of Jesus Christ. Jesus in the last year of his life uses physical force to throw the money changers out of the temple. This was the only time during the life of his ministry in which he used physical force against anyone. When Jews came to Jerusalem to pay their temple tax, they could only pay it with a special coin, the half shekel. This was a half ounce of pure silver, about the size of an American quarter. It was the only coin at that time which was pure silver and of assured weight, without the image of a pagan emperor. And therefore to the Jews it was the only coin acceptable to God. Unfortunately, these coins were not plentiful. The money changers had cornered the market on them, and so they raised the price of them to whatever the market could bear. Again, still happening today. They used the monopoly they had on these coins to make exorbitant profits, forcing the Jews to pay whatever these money changers demanded. Jesus threw the money changers out as the monopoly on these coins totally violated the sanctity of God's house. These money changers called for his death days later. Let's go to 1024. The money changers had control of medieval England's money supply and at this time are generally known as goldsmiths. Paper money started out, and this was simply a receipt you would get after depositing gold with a goldsmith in their safe rooms or vaults. This paper started being traded as it was far more convenient than carrying around a lot of heavy gold and silver coins. Over time, to simplify the process, the receipts were made to the bearer rather than to the individual depositor. That's why it says the bearer on demand on your banknotes today. Made it easily transferable without the need for a signature. This also broke the tie to any identifiable deposit of gold. Eventually the goldsmiths recognised that only a fraction of depositors ever came in and demanded their gold at any one time. So they found out how they could cheat the system. They started to issue more receipts than they had gold to back those receipts, and no one would be any the wiser. They would loan out these receipts, which were not backed by the gold they had in their depositories, and collect interest on them. This was the birth of the system we know today as fractional reserve banking. Like this system of today, this meant the goldsmiths were able to make astronomical amounts of money by loaning out what was essentially fraudulent receipts, as they were for gold the goldsmiths didn't even possess. As they gradually got more confident, they would loan out up to 10 times the amount they had in their deposits. To simplify how they made money on this, let's give an example in which the goldsmith charges the same rate of interest to creditors and debtors. In this exchange, a goldsmith would pay interest of 6% on gold you had deposited with them, and then charge 6% on the money. fraudulent receipts, sorry. You borrowed from them, as you would lend out 10 times what you had deposited with them. Whilst they are paying you 6% interest, they are making 60% interest. This is on your gold. The goldsmith also discovered that their control of this fraudulent money supply gave them control over the economy and the assets of the people. They exacted their control by rowing the economy between easy money and tight money. Boom and bust. In other words, the way they did this was to make money easy to borrow and therefore increase the amount of money in circulation, then suddenly tighten the money supply, taking it out of circulation by making loans more difficult to get or stopping offering them altogether. Sound familiar? So why did they do this? Simple. Because the result would be a certain percentage of the people being unable to pay their previous loans and not having the facility to take out new ones. So they would go bankrupt and be forced to sell their assets to the goldsmiths for literally pennies on the dollar. Sounds very much like the foreclosure of homes that happens today. This is exactly what happens in the world economy of today, but is referred to with words like the business cycle, boom and bust, recession and depression, in order to confuse the population of the money changer scam. Let's jump to 1100 AD. King Henry I succeeds King William II to the throne of England. During his reign, he decided to take the money changers and their power that they had over the people and turn it completely on his head. He did this by creating a completely new form of money that took the form of a stick. This stick was called a tally stick and ended up being the longest lasting form of currency, lasting 726 years until 1826, even though other currencies came and went in that same period and ran alongside the tally sticks. The tally stick was a stick of polished wood into which notches were cut along one side to indicate the denomination of money the stick represented. The stick was then split lengthwise through the notches so that both pieces had a record of the notches. The king kept one half to protect against counterfeiting, and the other half was spent into the economy and circulated as money. It was also one of the most successful money systems in history, as the king demanded that all the king's taxes had to be paid in tally sticks, so this increased their circulation and acceptance as a legitimate form of money. This system would work well in keeping the power away from the money changers in England. But in 1225, St Thomas Aquinas is born, the leading theologian of the Catholic Church, who argued that the charging of interest is wrong because it applies to double charging for both the money and the use of the money. This concept followed the teachings of Aristotle that taught the purpose of money was to serve the members of society and to facilitate the exchange of goods needed to lead a virtuous life. Interest was contrary to reason and justice because it put an unnecessary burden on the use of money. Thus, church law in the Middle Ages Europe forbade the charging of interest on loans and even made it a crime called usury. Everything was fine until 1509. Then King Henry VIII succeeded King Henry VII to the throne of England. During his reign, he relaxed the laws regarding usury, and the money changers did not waste any time in reasserting themselves over the population. They quickly made their gold and silver coin system plentiful again. It is interesting to note that under King Henry VIII, the Church of England separated from Roman Catholicism, whose church law prevented the charge of interest on money. In 1553, Queen Mary I succeeds Lady Jane Grey's 9-day reign to the throne of England. During her reign, Queen Mary I, a staunch Catholic, otherwise known as Queen Mary of Scots, tightened the usury laws again. The money changers were not amused, and in revenge they tightened the money supply by hoarding gold and silver coins and causing the economy to plummet. 5 years later, 1558, Queen Elizabeth I succeeds Queen Mary I, her half-sister, to the throne of England. During her reign, Queen Elizabeth I decided that in order to wrest control of the money supply, she would have to issue her own gold and silver coins. She did this through the public treasury and successfully took control of the money supply from the money changers. She also beheaded her half-sister, Mary Queen of Scots. Nice of her. So in 1609, the money changers in the Netherlands established the first central bank in history in Amsterdam. Let's jump to 1642. We have Oliver Cromwell is financed by the money changers for the purposes of fomenting a revolution in England and allowing them to take control of the money system again. After much bloodshed, Cromwell finally purges the Parliament, overthrows King Charles I and puts him to death in 1649. The money changers immediately consolidate their power and for the next few decades plunge Great Britain into a costly series of wars. They also take over a square mile of property in the centre of London, which becomes known as the City of London. Financial sewer of the world, as it is known today to anyone with half a brain. 1688, the money changers in England, following a series of squabbles with the Stuart kings, Charles II, 1660 to 1685, James II from 1685 to 1688, conspire with their far more successful money-changing counterparts in the Netherlands, who had already set up a central bank there. They decide to finance an invasion by William of Orange of the Netherlands, who they sound out and establish will be most favourable to them. The invasion is successful, and William of Orange ascends to the throne in England as King William III in 1689. Now in 1694, following a costly series of wars over the last 50 years, English government officials go cap in hand to the money changers for loans necessary to pursue their political purposes. The money changers agree to solve this problem in exchange for a government-sanctioned, privately owned bank which would issue money created out of nothing. This was deceptively named the Bank of England, for the sole purpose of duping the general public into believing it was part of the government, which it was not. Exactly the same as the Federal Reserve in America. Like any other private corporation, the Bank of England sold shares to get started. The private investors, whose names were never revealed, were supposed to put up £1.25 million in gold coins to buy their shares in the bank, but only £750,000 was ever received. Despite that, the bank was duly chartered and began loaning out several times the money it supposedly had in reserves or at interest. Although the Bank of England's private investors were never revealed, one of the directors, William Patterson, a Scot, stated, "The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing." Clear-cut admission of the fraud that they are perpetrating on everyone. Furthermore, the Bank of England would loan government officials as much of the new currency as they wanted, as long as they secured the debt by direct taxation of the British people. The Bank of England amounted to nothing less than the legal counterfeiting of a national currency for private gain, and thus any country that would fall under the control of a private bank would amount to nothing more than a plutocracy. Soon after the Bank of England was formed, it attacked the tally stick system as it was money outside of the power of the money changers, just as King Henry I had intended it to be. If you notice today, the Bank of England claims it's a national institution, which is not true. 3% of that national institution is owned by the Treasurer, who shall remain nameless, and it is pretty much impossible to find out who this person is, but I am pretty sure that you can trace it back to the Rothschild family. So let's go back again to 1698. Following 4 years of the Bank of England, their plan to control the money supply had come on in leaps and bounds. They had flooded the country with so much money that the government debt to the bank had grown from the initial £1.25 million to £16 million in only 4 years. That's an increase of 1,280%. Sounds very much like the payday loan rates that we have today. Why do they do it? Simple. If the money in circulation in a country is 5 million and a central bank is set up and prints another 15 million, stage 1 of the plan, sends it out into the economy through loans etc., then this will reduce the value of the initial 5 million in circulation. Again, if you look at it today, it's called quantitative easing. Destroys the value of the currency in existence. It's nothing other than a snide little con trick. This is because the initial £5 million is now only 25% of the economy. It will also give the bank control of 75% of the money in circulation, with the 15 million they sent out into the economy. This also causes inflation, which is the reduction in worth of money borne by the common person, due to the economy being flooded with too much money. An economy which the central bank are responsible for. As the common person's money is worth less, he has to go to the bank to get a loan to help run his business etc. And when the central bank are satisfied there are enough people with debt out there, the bank will tighten the supply of money by not offering loans. This is stage 2 of the plan. Stage 3 is sitting back and waiting for the debtors to then go bankrupt, allowing the bank to then seize from them real wealth, business and property, for pennies in the dollar or the pound. Inflation never affects a central bank. In fact, they are the only group who can benefit from it, as if they are ever short of money they can simply print more. Let's go to 1757 and Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin travels to England and would spend the next 18 years of his life there until just before the start of the American Revolution. 3 years later, 1760, Mayer Amschel Bauer changes his name to Mayer Amschel Rothschild and sets up the House of Rothschild. Soon learns that if he loans out money to governments and royalty, then this is far more profitable than loaning to individuals. This is because the loans made are bigger and backed by their nation's taxes. He trains his 5 sons in the art of money creation. So in 1764, back with Benjamin Franklin, he is asked by officials of the Bank of England to explain the prosperity of the colonies in America. He replies, "It is simple. In the colonies we issue our own money. It is called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportion to the demands of trade and industry to make the products pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating for ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power and we have no interest to pay no one." Interestingly enough, as a result of Franklin's statement, the British Parliament hurriedly passed the Currency Act of 1764. This prohibited colonial officials from issuing their own money and ordered them to pay all future taxes in gold or silver coins. Referring to after this act was passed, Franklin would state the following in his autobiography: "In 1 year, the conditions were so reversed that the era of prosperity ended and a depression set in, to such an extent that the streets of the colonies were filled with the unemployed." Again, it's still going on. The colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money, which created unemployment and dissatisfaction. The viability of the colonists to get power to issue their own money permanently out of the hands of King George III and his international bankers was the prime reason for the Revolutionary War and the War of Independence. Control of America's money supply will change hands 8 times since 1764. In 1775, April 19th, the start of the Revolutionary War in Lexington, Massachusetts. By this time, the colonies had been drained of silver and gold coins as a result of British taxation. As a result of this, the Continental government had no choice but to print money to finance the war. At the start of the Revolution, the American money supply stood at $12 million. by the end of the war it was nearly $500 million, and as a result the currency was virtually worthless. An example of this is that a pair of shoes now sold for $5,000. This also shows the danger of printing too much money. The reason the colonial script had worked was because just enough was used to facilitate trade, otherwise known as checks and balances. So in 1781, towards the end of the American Revolution, the Continental Congress were desperate for money, so they allowed Robert Morris, their financial superintendent, to open a privately owned central bank in the hope this would sort out the money problem. Morris was a wealthy man who had grown wealthier during the Revolution by trading in war materials. This first central bank in America was called the Bank of North America, which was set up with a 4-year charter and was closely modelled after the Bank of England. It was allowed to practice the fraudulent system of fractional reserve banking, so it could create money it didn't have, and then charge interest on it. The bank's charter called for private investors to put up $400,000 of initial capital, which Morris found himself unable to raise. Nevertheless, he unashamedly used his political influence to have gold deposited in the bank, which had been loaned to America by France. Morris then loaned the money he needed to buy this bank from this deposit of gold that belonged to the government, or rather the American people. This Bank of North America, again deceptively named so the common people would believe it was under the control of the government, was given a monopoly over the national currency. So what we got? 1785. Despite the promises of Robert Morris that this private loan Bank of North America would solve the problem with the money supply, of course the economy continued to plummet, forcing the Continental Congress not to renew the bank's charter. The leader of the effort to kill this bank was William Finley of Pennsylvania, who stated, "This institution, having no principle but that of avarice, will never be varied in its objective, to engross all the wealth, power and influence of the state." Meyer Amschel Rothschild moves his family home to a 5-storey home in Frankfurt, Germany, which he shares with the Schiff family of Kuhn, Loeb and Schiff. A descendant of both Rothschild and Schiff, Jacob Schiff, who would be born in this house, would some 128 years later be instrumental in the setting up of the Federal Reserve. 1787, colonial leaders assemble in Philadelphia to replace the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution. Governor Morris headed the final draft of the Constitution, and he knew the motivation of the bankers well, as he had once worked for them. Governor Morris, along with his former boss Robert Morris and Alexander Hamilton, had presented the original plan for the Bank of North America to the Continental Congress in the final year of the Revolution. Fortunately, Governor Morris by this time had discovered his conscience, defected from Robert Morris, and in a letter to James Madison dated July 2nd of this year, he stated, "The rich will strive to establish their dominion and enslave the rest. They always did, they always will. They will have the same effect here as elsewhere, if we do not, by the power of government, keep them in their proper spheres." James Madison was opposed to a privately owned central bank after seeing the exploitation of the people by the Bank of England. Thomas Jefferson was also against it, and Jefferson later made the following statement: "If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and the corporations which grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." Whether you agree with the means that they conquered the continent with and the genocide they inflicted onto the Native Americans, is by the by. Talking about money here. So sadly, the words of wisdom of Governor Morris and Thomas Jefferson fell on deaf ears. Alexander Hamilton, Robert Morris and Thomas Willing convinced the bulk of the delegates to sign this constitutional convention, not to give Congress the power to issue paper money. They were aware that most of these delegates were still reeling from the wild inflation of the paper money during the Revolution. These delegates also had short memories and didn't remember how well colonial scrip had worked during the war. Before the war, sorry. Or Benjamin Franklin's words of wisdom in 1764. As a result, the Constitution was silent on the issue of paper money by the government for the citizens, leaving a wide open door for money changers in the future. In 1790, less than 3 years after the Constitution had been signed, the newly appointed First Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, proposed a bill to the Congress calling for a new privately owned central bank. Alexander Hamilton was a traitor who should have been executed as a traitor. Interestingly, Alexander Hamilton's first job after graduating from law school in 1782 was as an aide to Robert Morris, a man who he had written to in 1781 stating, "A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing." A year later, 1791, the three main players behind the Bank of North America were Robert Morris, Alexander Hamilton and the bank's president, Thomas Willing. These men did not give up, and Alexander Hamilton, now Secretary of the Treasury, a man who described Robert Morris as his mentor, managed to get a new privately owned central bank through the new Congress. This new bank was called the First Bank of the United States, and was exactly the same as the Bank of North America. Robert Morris controlled it, Thomas Willing was the bank's president, and only the name had changed. This bank came into being after a year of intense debate and was given a 20-year charter. It was given a monopoly on printing United States currency, even though 80% of its stock was held by private investors. The other 20% was purchased by the United States government, but this was not to give it a piece of the action, but to provide the capital for the private investors to purchase the other 80%. As with the Bank of England and the old Bank of North America, these private investors never paid the full agreed amount for their shares. What happened was, through the fraudulent system of fractional reserve banking, the government's 20% stake, which was $2 million in cash, was used to make loans to its private investors to purchase the other 80% stake, $8 million, for this risk-free investment. Nice work if you can get it. Again, like the Bank of England and the old Bank of North America, the name First Bank of the United States was deliberately chosen to hide from the common people the fact that it was privately owned. The names of the investors in this bank were never revealed, although it is now widely believed that the Rothschilds were behind it. Interestingly, in 1790, when Alexander Hamilton proposed this bank in Congress, Mayor Amschel Rothschild made the following statement from his bank in Frankfurt, Germany. "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." One of the most quoted statements in history for anyone with any idea of how the world is run. So in 1796, the First Bank of the United States has been controlling the American money supply for 5 years. During this time, the American government has borrowed $8.2 million from this central bank, and prices in the country have increased by 72%. In other words, the currency has been devalued by 72%. In relation to this, Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State, said, "I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution taking from the federal government their power of borrowing." Now, 2 years later, 1798, Mayor Amschel Rothschild again sent his son Nathan, at the age of 21, to England with a sum of money equivalent to £20,000 to set up a money changers there. This went on for a couple of years, till 1800. In France, the Bank of France was set up as well by another one of Rothschild's sons. However, Napoleon decided France had to break free of the debt, and he therefore never trusted this bank. He declared that when a government is dependent on bankers for money, it is the bankers and not the government leaders that are in control. He stated, "The hand that gives is above the hand that takes. Money has no motherland. Financiers are without patriotism and without decency. Their sole object is to gain." Much like today's globalists. So, in 1803, the President of America, Thomas Jefferson, struck a deal with Napoleon in France. The United States would give Napoleon £3 million of gold in exchange for a huge chunk of territory west of the Mississippi River. This was called the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon used this gold to put together an army. He then used this army to set off across Europe, where he began to conquer everything in his path. The Bank of England quickly rose to oppose Napoleon and financed every nation in his path, as usual profiteering from both sides of the war. Prussia, Austria, and then finally Russia all went heavily into debt in a futile attempt to stop Napoleon. In 1807, 30-year-old Nathan Rothschild, head of the Bank of England in London, personally takes charge of a plan to smuggle a much needed shipment of gold through France to Spain to finance an attack by the Duke of Wellington on Napoleon from there. 1811, a bill was put before Congress to renew the charter of the First Bank of the United States. The legislators of both Pennsylvania and Virginia passed resolutions asking Congress to kill the bank. The national press openly attacked the bank, calling it a great swindle, a vulture, a viper, and a cobra. Nathan Rothschild gets in on the act and makes the following revealing statement as to who was really behind the First Bank of the United States. Quote, "Either the application for renewal of the Charter is granted, or the United States will find itself involved in a most disastrous war." Yes, it's extortion. When the smoke had cleared, the renewal bill was cleared by a single vote in the House, and was deadlocked in the Senate. At this point, America's fourth president, President James Madison, was in the White House. He was a staunch opponent of the bank, and he sent his Vice President, George Clinton, to break a tie in the Senate, which killed the bank. So in 1812, as promised by Nathan Rothschild, because the charter for the First Bank of the United States is not renewed, thousands have to die and the British attack America. However, as the British are still busy fighting Napoleon, they are unable to mount much of an assault, and the war ends in 1814 with America undefeated. This same year, Wellington's attacks from the south and other defeats eventually forced Napoleon to abdicate, and King Louis XVIII is crowned King of France. Napoleon is exiled to the tiny island of Elba off the coast of Italy. The next year, Napoleon escapes his exile and returns to Paris. French troops were sent to capture him, but he uses his charisma to convince his soldiers to rally around him, and they subsequently hail him as their emperor once again. In March, Napoleon assembles an army, which England's Duke of Wellington defeated less than 90 days later at Waterloo. Even though the outcome is predetermined, these bankers don't like to take any sort of risk. They're too used to a monopoly. Therefore, Nathan Rothschild sent a trusted courier named Rothworth to Waterloo, where he stayed on the edge of the battlefield. Once the battle was decided, Rothworth took off for the Channel and delivered the news of Wellington's victory to Nathan Rothschild a full 24 hours before Wellington's own courier. Nathan Rothschild hurried to the London stock market and took in his usual position. All eyes were on him, as Rothschild had a legendary communications network. Rothschild stood there looking forlorn and suddenly started selling. The other traders believed that this was meant he had heard that Napoleon had won, so they all started selling frantically. The market subsequently plummeted. Soon everyone was selling their consols, another word for a British government bond, but then Rothschild suddenly started buying them all up through his agents on the floor for a fraction of what they were worth only hours before. Pennies on the pound. A lot of these councils were able to be converted to Bank of England stock, which is how Rothschild took the control of the Bank of England and therefore the British money supply. Interestingly, 100 years later, the New York Times ran a story stating that Nathan Rothschild's grandson had attempted to secure a court order to suppress a book with this in it, what we would call today insider trading. The Rothschild family claimed the story was untrue and libelous, but the court denied the Rothschilds' request and ordered the family to pay all court costs because the story was true. Nathan Rothschild openly brags that in his 17 years in England he had increased his initial £20,000 stake given to him by his father 2,500 times to £50 million. Some people may ask, why do bankers want war? The answer is very simple. Bankers finance both sides of any war. They do this because war is the ultimate debt generator of them all. A nation will borrow any amount for victory, even though the banks have already predetermined the outcome. The ultimate loser has loaned just enough money to hold out in vain hope of victory, and the ultimate winner is given enough to ensure that he does win. So how do the banks ensure they will get all their money back? Very easy. Such loans are given on the guarantee that the victor will honour the debts of the vanquished. Never mind the thousands of troops that give their lives on the pretext it is for the honour of their respective nations, when it is in actuality for the profits of bankers. In fact, during the period between the founding of the Bank of England in 1694 and Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo that year, England had been at war for 56 years, with much of the remaining time spent preparing for war. If it's a good business for bankers' profits, then why change it? All wars are bankers' wars. So in 1816, the American Congress passes a bill permitting yet another privately owned central bank. This bank was called the Second Bank of the United States, and its charter was a carbon copy of that of its predecessor, the First Bank of the United States. The United States government would once again supposedly own 20% of the shares of the bank. Their share was again paid up front into the bank, and thanks to fraudulent fractional reserve lending, this was transformed into loans to the private investors who once again purchased the remaining 80% of the shares. Just as before, the names of these investors were kept a secret. So in 1826, we have the removal of the tally stick, which was taken out of circulation in England. 2 years later, 1828, after 12 years during which the Second Bank of the United States ruthlessly manipulated the American economy to the detriment of the people, but to the benefit of their own money-grabbing ends, the American people had surprisingly had enough. Opponents of this bank nominated Senator Andrew Jackson of Tennessee to run for president. To the dismay of the money changers, Jackson won the presidency and made it quite clear he intended to kill this bank at the first opportunity. He started out during his first term in office to root out the bank's many minions from government service. Just to illustrate how deep this cancer was, he fired 2,000 of only 11,000 employees of the federal government, just over 20%. So in 1832, the Second Bank of the United States asked Congress to pass a renewal of the bank's charter 4 years early to combat Jackson. Congress complied and sent the bill to President Jackson for signing. President Jackson vetoed this bill, and in his veto message he stated the following: "It's not our own citizens only who are to receive the bounty of our government. More than 8 million of the stock of the bank are held by foreigners. Is there no danger to our liberty and independence in a bank that in its nature has so little to bind it to our country? Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies and holding thousands of our citizens' independence would be more formidable and dangerous than a military power of any army. If government would confine itself to equal protection, and as heaven does it rains, shower the favour alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me there seems to be wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles." In July of that year, Congress was unable to override President Jackson's veto. President Jackson then stood for re-election, and for the first time in American history, he took his argument directly to the people by taking his re-election campaign on the road. His campaign slogan was "Jackson and no bank." Even though the bankers poured over $3 million into President Jackson's opponent, the Republican Senator Henry Clay, President Jackson was re-elected by a landslide in November. President Jackson knew the battle was only beginning, however, and following his victory he stated, "The hydra of corruption is only scorched, not dead." So in 1833, President Jackson appoints Richard B. Taney as Secretary of State for the Treasury, with instructions to start removing the government's deposits from the Second Bank of the United States. President Jackson's previous two Secretaries of State for the Treasury, William J. Duane and Lewis McLean, had both refused to comply with President Jackson's request and were fired as a result. However, the head of the Second Bank of the United States, Nicholas Biddle, used his influence to get the Senate to reject Roger B. Taney's nomination, and even threatened to cause a depression if the bank was not rechartered. Biddle stated, "This worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges, he is to have his way with the bank. He is mistaken." Biddle then went on to brazenly admit that the bank was intending to make money scarce in order to force the hand of Congress into rechartering the bank. He went on to state, "Nothing but widespread suffering will produce any effect on Congress. Our only safety is pursuing a steady course of firm restriction. And I have no doubt that such a course will ultimately lead to restoration of the currency and recharter of the bank." What Biddle has done with that statement is prove to the world what central banks were really about. He made good on his word, and the Second Bank of the United States sharply contracted the money supply by calling in old loans and refusing to issue new ones. Naturally, a financial panic ensued, followed by America being plunged into a deep depression. Biddle then unashamedly blamed President Jackson for the crash, claiming that it was Jackson's withdrawal of federal funds that had caused it. This crash plunged wages and prices, unemployment soared, along with business bankruptcies. The United States was in uproar, and newspaper editors blasted the president in editorials. In 1835, Congress assembled what was called the Panic Session, and on 27th of March, President Jackson was officially censured by Congress for withdrawing funds from the Second Bank of the United States, in a vote which passed the Senate by 26 to 20. It was the first time a president had ever been censored by Congress, and Jackson stated of the bank, "You're a den of thieves, vipers, and I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God I will rout you out." However, Pennsylvania Governor George Wolfe came out in support of President Jackson and strongly criticised the bank. This, coupled with the fact that Nicholas Biddle had been caught posting in public about the bank's plan to crash the American economy, caused a shift in opinion of President Jackson's action. In a complete U-turn, on April the 4th, the House of Representatives voted 134 to 82 against rechartering the bank. This was followed by another strong vote which established a special committee to investigate whether the bank had caused the crash. However, when the investigating committee arrived at the bank's doors in Philadelphia with a subpoena authorising them to inspect the books, Nicholas Biddle refused to give them up, or allow inspection of correspondence with congressmen relating to their personal loans and advancements he had made to them. He also refused to testify before the committee in Washington. 1836, the charter for the Second Bank of the United States expires and the bank ceases functioning as America's central bank. Nicholas Biddle was later arrested and charged with fraud, although he should have been charged with treason. He was tried and acquitted but died in 1844, still battling civil suits. 2 years later, in 1838, On January the 8th, President Jackson pays off the final instalment of the national debt, which had been necessitated by allowing the banks to issue currency for government bonds rather than simply issuing treasury notes without such debt. He was the only president to ever pay off the debt. On January the 30th, an assassin called Richard Lawrence tried to shoot President Jackson, but both pistols misfired. Lawrence was later found not guilty by reason of insanity. However, after his release, he openly bragged that powerful people in Europe had put him up to the task and promised to protect him if he were caught. When asked what his most important accomplishment had been in life, President Jackson stated without hesitation, "I killed the bank." It would take the money changers 75 years to establish the next central bank, the Federal Reserve. This time they would take no chances and use one of their own, Jacob Schiff, from the Rothschild bloodline to undertake this. In 1850, Jacob James Rothschild in France is said to be worth 600 million francs, which at the time was 150 million francs more than all of the other bankers in France put together. In 1852, future British Prime Minister William Gladstone stated the following about when he became Chancellor of the Exchequer this year. "From the time I took office as Chancellor of the Exchequer, I began to learn that the state held, in the face of the bank and the city, an essentially false position as to finance. The government itself was not to be a substantive power, but was to leave the money power supreme and unquestioned." 1861, 1 month after the inauguration of President Abraham Lincoln, the American Civil War got underway at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, after South Carolina left the Union. Slavery has always been cited as the cause of the war, but this was simply not the case. As President Lincoln himself stated, "I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the state where it now exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. My paramount objective is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." The real reason for the war was that the southern states were in a dire economic situation due to the actions of the northern states. Northern industrialists had used trade tariffs to prevent the southern states from buying cheaper European goods. We see the same thing going on today. They're otherwise known as sanctions. Europe subsequently retaliated by stopping cotton imports from the south. Thus the south were being forced to pay more for goods whilst having their income slashed. This is when the money changers saw the opportunity to divide and conquer America by plunging it into civil war. This is confirmed by Otto von Bismarck when he was Chancellor of Germany from 1871 to 1890, when he stated, "The division of the United States into federations of equal force was decided long before the Civil War by the high financial powers of Europe. These bankers were afraid that the United States, if they remained as one bloc and as one nation, would attain economic and financial independence, which would upset their financial domination over the world." Only months after these first shots in South Carolina, the central bankers loaned Napoleon III of France, the same Napoleon of the Battle of Waterloo's nephew, 210 million francs to seize Mexico and then station troops along the southern border of the United States by taking advantage of the American Civil War to return Mexico to colonial rule. This was in violation of the Monroe Doctrine, which was issued by President James Monroe during his 7th annual State of the Union address to Congress in 1823. This doctrine proclaimed the United States' opinion that European powers should no longer colonize the Americas or interfere with the affairs of sovereign nations located in the Americas, such as the United States, Mexico and others. In return, the United States planned to stay neutral in wars between European powers and in wars between a European power and its colonies. However, if these latter types of wars were to occur in the Americas, the US would view such action as hostile towards itself. Whilst the French were breaching the Monroe Doctrine in Mexico, the British followed suit by moving 11,000 troops into Canada and positioning them along America's northern border. President Lincoln knew he was in trouble, so he went with his secretary to the Treasury, Solomon P. Chase, to New York to apply for the loans necessary to fund America's defence. The money changers had engineered the war to make the Union fail, and were not about to save it now. So they offered loans at 24% to 36% interest. President Lincoln declined this as they knew he would, and returned to Washington, where he sent for Colonel Richard Taylor of Chicago, who he put in charge of the problem of how he should finance the war. During one meeting, President Lincoln asked Colonel Taylor what proposals he had come up with to finance the war. Colonel Taylor stated, "Why, Lincoln, that is easy. Just get Congress to pass a bill authorising the printing of full legal tender treasury notes and pay your soldiers with them, and go ahead and win your war with them also." President Lincoln asked Colonel Taylor if the people of the United States would accept the notes. Colonel Taylor said, "The people or anyone else will not have any choice in the matter if you make them full legal tender. They will have the full sanction of the government and be just as good as any money, as Congress is given that express right by the Constitution." In 1862, President Lincoln began the printing of $450 million worth of new bills. These bills were printed in green ink on the reverse side in order to distinguish them from other bills in circulation, and were called greenbacks. These were printed at no interest to the federal government and were used to pay the troops and purchase their supplies. President Lincoln would be the last president to issue debt-free United States notes, and on this subject he stated, "The government should create, issue and circulate all the currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers. The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of government, but is in the government's greatest creative opportunity. By the adoption of these principles, the taxpayer will be saved immense sums of interest. Money will cease to be master and become the servant of humanity." In response to this statement, the Times of London publishes a propaganda piece obviously put out by the bankers, containing the following statement: "If that mischievous financial policy, which had its origin in the North American Republic, should become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off debts and be without a debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous beyond precedent in the history of civilized governments of the world. The brains and the wealth of all countries will go to North America. That government must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy in the globe." The bankers' response to this in 1863 was to strike back, with President Lincoln needing further congressional authority to issue more greenbacks. Lincoln was forced into allowing the bankers to push their National Banking Act through Congress. The most important part of this act was that from now on, the entire United States money supply would be created out of debt by the national banks buying United States government bonds and issuing them for reserves of banknotes. On top of this monopoly, the national banks were allowed to operate under a virtual tax-free status. This banking scam is best explained by historian John Kenneth Galbraith, who stated, "In numerous years following the war, the federal government ran a heavy surplus. It could not, however, pay off its debts, retire its securities, because to do so meant there would be no bonds to back the national banknotes. To pay off the debt was to destroy the money supply." Later this year, Tsar Alexander II gave President Lincoln some unexpected help. The Tsar issued orders that if either England or France actively intervened in the American Civil War and helped the South, Russia would consider such action a declaration of war. To show that he wasn't messing about, he sent part of his Pacific Fleet to port in San Francisco. This wasn't because the Tsar was benevolent towards America. Instead, he was very clever. He, like Otto von Bismarck in Germany, could clearly see what the money changers were up to. Indeed, he had already refused to let them set up a central bank in Russia. He understood if America was to come under the control of Britain or France, then America would be under the control of central bankers once again, and such an expansion of the bankers' empire would mean they would eventually threaten Russia. So in 1864, President Lincoln is re-elected on November the 8th, and on November the 21st he wrote to a friend the following: "The money power preys upon the nations in times of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy. more insolvent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. Salomon P. Chase, now President Lincoln's former Secretary to the Treasury, stated, "My agency in promoting the passage of the National Banking Act was the greatest financial mistake in my life. It has built up a monopoly which affects every interest in the country." Next year, 1865, on April the 14th, 41 days after his second inauguration and just 5 days after General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox, President Lincoln is shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theatre. He would later die of his injuries. Subsequent allegations that international bankers were responsible for President Lincoln's assassination would be made in the Canadian House of Commons nearly 70 years later in 1934. The person who revealed this was a Canadian attorney, General G. McGreer. He had obtained evidence deleted from the public record, provided to him by Secret Service agents at the trial of John Wilkes Booth after Booth's death. McGeer stated that it showed that John Wilkes Booth was a mercenary working for the international bankers. His speech would be reported in an article in the Vancouver Sun dated the 2nd of May 1934, which stated, "Abraham Lincoln, the murdered emancipator of the slaves, was assassinated through the machinations of a group representative of the international bankers, who feared the United States President's national credit ambitions. There was only one group in the world at that time who had any reason to desire the death of Lincoln. They were the men opposed to his national currency programme and who had fought him throughout the whole Civil War on his policy of greenback currency." General G. McGreer also stated that Lincoln's assassination was not purely because the international bankers wanted to re-establish a central bank in America, but also because they wanted to base America's currency on gold, which they of course controlled. They wanted to put America on a gold standard. This was in direct opposition to President Lincoln's policy of issuing greenbacks based solely on the good faith and credit of the United States. Or in other words, the labour of the people. The Vancouver Sun article also quoted General G. McGreer with the following statement: "They were the men interested in the establishment of the gold standard and the right of the bankers to manage the currency and credit of every nation in the world. With Lincoln out of the way, they were able to proceed with that plan and did proceed with it in the United States. Within 8 years after Lincoln's assassination, silver was demonetised and the gold standard system set up in the United States." In 1866, the European central bankers wanted the reinstitution of a central bank under their control and an American currency backed by gold. They chose gold as gold has always been relatively scarce and therefore a lot easier to monopolise than, for example, silver, which was plentiful in the United States and had been found in huge quantities with the opening of the American West. So on April the 12th, Congress went back to work at the bidding of the European central bankers. It passed the Contraction Act, which authorised the Secretary of the Treasury to contract the money supply by retiring some of the greenbacks in circulation. This money contraction and its disastrous results is explained by Theodore R. Thorin and Richard F. Walker in their book The Truth in Money Book, in which they state the following: "The hard times which occurred after the Civil War could have been avoided if the greenback legislation had continued as President Lincoln had intended. Instead, there were a series of money panics, what we call recessions, which put pressure on Congress to enact legislation to place the banking system under centralised control. Eventually, the Federal Reserve Act was passed on December the 23rd, 1913. This is how the Contraction Act passed by Congress affected America. The money supply goes down, purely because currency in circulation is being withdrawn. In 1866, there was $1.8 trillion in circulation, which amounted to per capita, in other words per person, which is what today's GDP is based on. Per person, each citizen in America, $50.46. In 1867, there was only 1.3 trillion in circulation, which decreased the per capita amount to $44 per person. In 1876, again it was decreased to $600 million, which left the citizens with only $14.60 per capita. 1886 decreased again to $400 million, which left the people with only $6.67 per capita. Therefore, in the 20 years since 1866, 2/3 of the American money supply had been called in by the bankers, representing a 760% loss in buying power over these 20 years. The money became scarce simply because bank loans were called in and no new ones were given. Sounds like the credit crunch, doesn't it? In 1872, Ernest Syde is sent to America on a mission from the Rothschild-owned Bank of England. He is given 100,000 American dollars, which he is to use as a bribe to bribe as many congressmen as he can for the purposes of getting silver demonetised, as it had been found in huge quantities in the American West, which would eat into the Rothschilds' profits. In 1873, Ernest Syde obviously spent his money wisely, as Congress passed the Coinage Act, which results in the minting of silver dollars being abruptly stopped. Furthermore, Representative Samuel Hooper, who introduced the bill in the House, even admitted that Ernest Syde, I'm not sure if it's Syde or Syde, but anyway, had actually drafted the legislation. In 1874, Ernest Syde himself admitted who was behind the demonetising of silver in America when he makes the following statement: "I went to America in the winter of 1872-73, authorised to secure, if I could, the passage of a bill demonetising silver. It was in the interests of those I represented, certainly not the people of America, the governors of the Bank of England, to have it done. By 1873, gold coins were the only form of coin money." 2 years later, 1876, due to the manipulation of the money supply in America, 1/3 of the workforce is unemployed and unrest is growing. There are even calls for a return to greenback money or silver money. As a result, Congress creates the United States Silver Commission to investigate the problem. This commission clearly understood that the national bankers were the cause of the problem with their deliberate contraction of the money supply. An excerpt of their report reads as follows: "The disaster of the Dark Ages was caused by decreasing money and falling prices. Without money, civilization could not have had a beginning, and with a diminishing supply it must languish and, unless relieved, finally perish. At the Christian era, the metallic money of the Roman Empire amounted to $1.8 trillion. By the end of the 15th century, it had shrunk to less than $200 million. History records no other such disastrous transition as that from the Roman Empire to the Dark Ages." Despite this damning report from the Commission, Congress took no action. In 1877, riots start to break out from Pittsburgh to Chicago. The bankers get together to decide what to do, and they decided to hang on, as they knew that despite the violence they were now firmly back in control. At the meeting of the American Bankers Association, they urged their membership to do everything in their power to put down any notion of a return to greenbacks. The American Bankers Association Secretary James Buell even wrote a letter to the members in which he blatantly called on the banks to subvert both Congress and the press. In this letter he stated, "It is advisable to do all in your power to sustain such prominent daily and weekly newspapers, especially the agricultural and religious press, as well as oppose the greenback issue of paper money, and that you will also withhold patronage from all applicants who are not willing to oppose the government issue of money. To repeal the Act creating banknotes or to restore to circulation issue of money will be to provide the people with money and will therefore seriously affect our individual profits as bankers and lenders. See your congressman at once and engage him to support our interests that we may control legislation." In 1878, James Buell's letter clearly had some effect, as although pressure mounted in Congress for change, the press tried to turn the general public away from the truth. An example of this is from the New York Tribune in their 10th of January edition, in which is stated in a banker's propaganda piece The capital of the country is organised at last, and we will see whether Congress will dare to fly in its face. This early control of the media didn't work entirely nevertheless, as on February the 28th Congress passed the Sherman Law. This law allowed the minting of a limited number of silver dollars, ending the 5-year hiatus. However, this did not mean that anyone who brought silver to the United States Mint could have it struck into silver dollars free of charge, as in the period prior to Ernest Sade's Coinage Act in 1873. Gold backing of the American currency also remained. However, this Sherman Law did ensure that some money began to flow into the economy again, and coupled with the fact that the bankers now realised that they were still firmly in control, they started issuing loans again, and the post-war civil depression was finally over. In 1881, the American people elected Republican James Garfield as the 20th President of the United States. This was very worrisome to the money changers because as a congressman he had been the chairman of the Appropriations Committee and was a member of Banking and Currency. The money changers were therefore aware that President Garfield was in full knowledge of their scam on the American people. Indeed, following his inauguration, President Garfield stated, "Whoever controls the volume of money in any currency is absolute master of all industry and commerce, and when you realise that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate." Strangely enough, within a few weeks of making that statement, President Garfield was assassinated on the 2nd of July. In 1891, the money changers spent the last decade creating economic booms followed by depressions, boom and bust, so that they could buy up thousands of homes and farms for pennies on the dollar. They were preparing to take the economy down again in the near future, and in a shocking memo sent out by the American Bankers Association, which would come out in the Congressional Record more than 20 years later, the following is stated. On September the 1st, 1894, we will not renew our loans under any consideration. On September 1st, we will demand our money. We will foreclose and become mortgages in possession. We can take 2/3 of the farms west of the Mississippi and thousands of them east of the Mississippi as well, at our own price. Then the farmers will become tenants as in England. Can anybody see a pattern developing here? In 1891, the American Bankers Association, as printed in the Congressional Record of April 29, 1913. In 1896, the central issue in the presidential campaign is the issue of more silver money. Senator William Jennings Bryan from Nebraska, a Democrat aged only 36, makes an emotional speech at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago entitled Crown of Thorns and Cross of Gold. Senator Bryan stated, "We will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labour this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The bankers naturally supported the Republican candidate William McKinley, who in return favoured the gold standard. Furthermore, those in the McKinley campaign got manufacturers and industrialists to inform their employees that if Bryan were elected, all factories and plants would close and there would be no work. This tactic succeeded. McKinley beat Bryan, albeit by a small margin. In 1898, Pope Leo XIII stated the following on the subject of usury, which is forbidden for Muslims, which is why the central bankers have been attacking the Islamic countries for the last 20 years. Anyway, back to 1898. Pope Leo XIII stated the following on the subject of usury. On the one hand, there is a party which holds the power because it holds the wealth, which has in its grasp all labour and all trade, which manipulates for its own benefit and its own purposes all the sources of supply, and which is powerfully represented in the councils of state itself. On the other side, there is a needy and powerless multitude, sore and suffering. Rapacious usury, which, although more than once condemned by the Church, is nevertheless under a different form but with the same guilt, still practised by avaricious and grasping men, so that a small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the masses of the poor a yoke little better than slavery itself. Let's jump to 1907. And during the early 1900s, the money changers were anxious to advance their business of setting up another private central bank for America. Rothschild, Jacob Schiff, the head of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, in a speech to the New York Chamber of Commerce stated, or rather threatened, "Unless we have a central bank with adequate control of credit resources, this country is going to undergo the most severe and far-reaching money panic in its history." They put Rothschild agent J.P. Morgan at the forefront of their charge. Interestingly, J.P. Morgan, yes, that's J.P. Morgan of Morgan & Chase. Interestingly, J.P. Morgan's father, Julius Morgan, had been America's financial agent to the British, and after Julius's death, J.P. Morgan took on a British partner, Edward Grenville, who was a long-time director of the Bank of England. This year was the year of the money changers' attack. J.P. Morgan and his cohorts secretly crashed the stock market. They were aware that thousands of small banks were so vastly overextended, some only had reserves of 1% under the fraudulent fractional reserve principle. Within only a few days, bank runs became commonplace across the nation. Morgan then stepped up and publicly announced that he would support these failing banks. What he failed to mention is that he would do this by manufacturing money out of nothing. And then what happened? Surprise, surprise, Congress let him do it. So Morgan manufactured $200 million of this completely reserveless private money, purchased goods and services with it, and sent some of it to his branch banks to lend out at interest. As a result, the general public regained confidence in money, but most importantly, it meant the banking power was now further consolidated into the hands of a few large banks. It's a bloody credit crunch. 100 years earlier. In 1908, with the widespread financial panic over, J.P. Morgan was hailed as a hero by the then president of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson, who even crassly or arrogantly stated, "All this trouble could be averted if we appointed a committee of 6 or 7 public-spirited men like J.P. Morgan to handle the affairs of our country." President Theodore Roosevelt had also signed into law, following the financial panic, a bill creating the National Monetary Commission. This commission was supposed to study the banking problem and make recommendations to Congress. Naturally, the commission was packed with J.P. Morgan's friends and cronies, in other words, Rothschild agents. The chairman was Senator Nelson Aldrich from Rhode Island, and he represented the Newport, Rhode Island homes of America's richest banking families. His daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr., and together they had 5 sons, including Nelson, who would become Vice President in 1974, and David, who would become head of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's the same David Rockefeller, but still cutting about, spreading misery everywhere. Following the setting up of this National Monetary Commission, Senator Aldrich immediately embarked on a 2-year fact-finding tour of Europe, where he consulted at length with the private central bankers in England, France and Germany, or rather Rothschild. The total cost of this 2-year trip to the American taxpayer, $300,000. Yes, $300,000, that is not a misprint. So in 1910 we have The Creature from Jekyll Island. It's a very interesting book, you should look it up. Senator Aldrich returns from his 2-year European fact-finding mission on the 22nd of November. Shortly afterwards, some of America's most wealthy and powerful men boarded Senator Aldrich's private rail car in the strictest secrecy. They journeyed to Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. In this group were Paul Wahlberg, who was earning $500,000 a year salary from the Rothschild-owned firm Kuhn Loeb and Company. This salary was for him to lobby for a privately owned central bank in America. Also present was Jacob Schiff, a Rothschild who had purchased Kuhn Loeb and Company shortly after he arrived in America from England. The Rothschilds, Wahlbergs and Schiffs, interconnected by marriage, were essentially the same family. So it's more like a mafia to me. Secrecy at this meeting was so tight that all the participants were cautioned to use only first names to prevent servants from learning their identities. Years later, one participant, Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank and a representative of the Rockefeller family, confirmed the Jekyll Island trip in a 9th of February 1935 edition of the Saturday Evening Post, in which he stated, "I was as secretive indeed, as furtive as any conspirator." Conspirator? Oh my god. Discovery we knew simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted if it were to be exposed that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill. That bill would have no chance whatsoever of passage by Congress. So we've got private individuals writing banking bills for a whole nation. It was not just the setting up of a central bank that was on the agenda. Other problems for these bankers were that the market share of these big national banks was shrinking fast. In the first 10 years of the century, the number of United States banks had more than doubled to over 20,000. By 1913, only 29% of all banks were national banks, and they held only 57% of all deposits. As John D. Rockefeller put it, competition is sin. Senator Aldrich later admitted in a magazine article, before passage of this act, the New York bankers could only dominate the reserves of New York. Now we are able to dominate bank reserves of the entire country. So one of the aims of these conspirators was to bring these new banks under their control. Secondly, the nation's economy was so strong that corporations were starting to finance their own expansions out of profits instead of taking out huge loans from large banks. Indeed, in the first 10 years of the century, 70% of corporate funding came from profits. Basically, American industry was becoming independent of the money changers, which is a no-no. And the money changers were not about to let that happen. No chance. There was also much discussion regarding the name of the new bank, which took place in a conference room in the Jekyll Island Club Hotel. Aldrich believed the word bank should not even appear in the name. Wahlberg wanted to call the legislation the National Reserve Bill or the Federal Reserve Bill. The idea was not only to give the impression that the purpose of the new central bank was to stop bank runs, but also to conceal its monopoly character. However, it was Senator Aldrich, the egomaniac, who insisted it be called the Aldrich Bill. So after 9 days at Jekyll Island, the group dispersed. This group of conspirators immediately set up an educational fund of $5 million to finance professors at top universities to endorse the new bank. The new central bank would be very similar to the old Bank of the United States, in that it would be given a monopoly over United States currency and create that money out of nothing. Also, in order to make the public think it was under control of the government, the plan called for the central bank to be run by a board of governors appointed by the President and approved by the Senate. This would not cause any undue problems for the bankers, as they knew they could use their money to buy influence over the politicians in order to ensure the men they wanted got appointed to the board of governors. Excuse me. In 1912, the Aldrich Bill was presented to Congress for debate. This was very quickly identified as a bill to benefit the bankers, or an expression for them which was coined at the time, the money trust. During the debate, the Republican Charles A. Lindbergh stated, "The Aldrich plan is the Wall Street plan. It means another panic if necessary. to intimidate the people. Aldrich, paid by the government to represent the people, proposes a plan for the trusts instead. Charles A. Lindbergh was also a war hero. As this debate continued on, the bankers realised they didn't have enough support, so the Republican leadership never brought the Aldrich bill to a vote. Instead, the bankers decided to switch their attention to the Democrats and started heavily financing Woodrow Wilson. Bloody sellout that he is, the Democratic presidential nominee. The Wall Street banker Bernard Baruch was put in charge of the Wilson project, and as historian James Perloff stated, Baruch brought Wilson to the Democratic Party headquarters in New York in 1912, leading him like one would a poodle on a string. Wilson received an indoctrination course from the leaders convened there. During the Democratic presidential campaign, Wilson and the rulers of the Democratic Party pretended to oppose the Aldrich bill, as Republican Representative Louis T. McFadden explained 20 years later when he was chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee. The Aldrich bill was condemned in the platform. When Woodrow Wilson was nominated, the men who ruled the Democratic Party promised the people that if they were returned to power, there would be no central bank established here while they held the reins of government. 13 months later, that promise was broken. A promise, lie. And the Wilson administration, under the tutelage of those sinister Wall Street figures who stood behind Colonel House, established here in our free country the worm-eating monarchical institution of the King's Bank, to control us from the top downwards and to shackle us from the cradle to the grave. Top-down economics in all its glory. On November 5th, Woodrow Wilson was elected, and J.P. Morgan, Paul Warburg, Bernard Baruch et al. Advanced a new plan which Warburg called the Federal Reserve System. The leadership of the Democratic Party hailed this new bill, called the Glass-Owen Bill, as totally different to the Aldrich bill, when in fact it was virtually identical. Funnily enough, the Democrats were so vehement in their denial of the similarity of the Glass-Owen bill to the Aldrich bill that Paul Warburg, the creator of both bills, had to inform his paid friends in Congress that the two bills were virtually identical and therefore they must vote to pass it. Warburg stated, "Brushing aside the external differences affecting the shells, we find the kernels of the two systems very closely resembling and related to one another." However, this admission by Warburg was not made public. Instead, Senator Aldrich and Frank Vanderlip, the little traitors that they were, and the president of Rockefeller's National City Bank of New York were to publicly state their opposition to the bill in order to make people think that the bill imposed was radically different to the Aldrich bill. Indeed, Frank Vanderlip stated years later in the Saturday Evening Post, "Although the Aldrich Federal Reserve Plan was defeated when it bore the name Aldrich, nevertheless its essential points were all contained in the plan that was finally adopted." So in 1939, with Congress needing a vote on the Glass-Owen bill, they called Ohio Attorney Alfred Crozier to testify. However, Crozier noticed the similarities between the Aldrich bill and the Glass-Owen bill and subsequently stated, "The bill grants just what Wall Street and the big banks for 25 years have been striving for, private instead of public control of currency. It, the Glass-Owen bill, does this as completely as the Aldrich bill. Both measures rob the government and the people of all effective control over the public's money, and vest in the banks exclusively the dangerous power to make money among the people scarce or plenty." The debate on this bill was not going well for the banks, with many senators intimating the bill was corrupt and deceitful. However, the bank was approved through the Senate on December 22nd. How did this happen? Because most of the senators had left town to return home for the Christmas holidays, so most of them didn't even vote on it. Furthermore, these senators had been assured by the leadership that nothing would be done regarding this bill until long after the Christmas recess. Representative Charles A. Lindbergh Sr. stated, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth, When the President signs this bill, the invisible government of the monetary power will be legalised. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking and currency bill. Interestingly, only a few weeks earlier in October, Congress finally passed a bill legalising direct income tax of the people. This was in the form of a bill pushed through by Senator Aldrich, which is now commonly known as the 16th Amendment. This income tax law was fundamental to the Federal Reserve. This is because the Federal Reserve was a system which was run up essentially an unlimited federal debt, which would be payable by the people. The only way to guarantee the payment of interest on this debt was to directly tax the people, as they had done with the Bank of England. If the Federal Reserve had to rely on contributions from the states, they would be dealing with bigger entities who could revolt and refuse to pay the interest on their own money, or at least bring political pressure to bear in order to keep the debt small. In actuality, this 16th Amendment was never ratified, and therefore many American citizens do not pay their income tax. Also, back in 1895, the Supreme Court had also found an income tax law similar to the 16th Amendment as unconstitutional. The Supreme Court also found a corporate tax law unconstitutional in 1909. There are many case law precedents. Another important amendment that was put through this year in the 17th Amendment. This provided for the direct election by the people of 2 senators from each state, as opposed to the original system of having state legislators elect United States senators. More democratic, you would think, until you realise these bankers could now provide the funds for their hand-picked people to run for the Senate, and thus avoid future problems like getting the Federal Reserve through the Senate. Bought and paid for, just like today's politicians. Anyway, let's get back to the Federal Reserve. If you are in any doubt as to whether the Federal Reserve is a private company, a basic check the public can carry out is in their phone book. Look under the government pages. It's not listed, but you will find it listed within the business pages. It's not a government entity. It's nothing to do with the government. Actually, some recent evidence has come forward as to who really owns the Federal Reserve, and they are the following banks. 1. Rothschild Bank of London. Number 2. The Warburg Bank of Hamburg. Thirdly, the Rothschild Bank of Berlin. 4th, Lehman Brothers of New York. Number 5, Lazard Brothers of Paris. 6, Kuhn Loeb Bank of New York. 7, Israel Moses Safe Banks of Italy. Number 8, Goldman Sachs of New York. Number 9, Warburg Bank of Amsterdam. Number 10, Chase Manhattan Bank of New York. All subsidiaries of the Rothschild banking empire, every single last one of them. Also, some argue that the Federal Reserve is a quasi-government agency, yet the President appoints only 2 of the 7 members of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors every 4 years, and he appoints them to 14-year terms, which is far longer than any term he could possibly serve as President. The Senate confirms these appointments, but as we have seen, that is the idea, because these are the very people handpicked by the bankers who also finance their campaigns, as you've seen with Mr. Obama. Wall Street puppet that he is. So this ensures their loyalty to them and not the people. Let's summarise how the Federal Reserve creates money out of nothing. It is a 4-step process. Number 1, the Federal Open Market Committee approves the purchase of United States bonds. Number 2, the bonds are purchased by the Federal Reserve. Number 3, the Federal Reserve pays for these bonds with electronic credits to the seller's bank. These credits are based on nothing. Number 4, the banks use these deposits as reserves. They can loan out over 10 times the amount of their reserves to new borrowers, all at interest. If you don't really know what bonds are, they're simply promises to pay government IOUs. People purchase bonds in order to get a secure rate of interest. At the end of the term of the bond, the government repays the bond plus interest and the bond is destroyed. Well, that's the idea. That's not what happens. Let's look at an example of how this works with a Federal Reserve purchase of $1 million of bonds. This then gets turned into over $10 million in bank accounts. The Federal Reserve in effect creates 10% of this totally new $10 million and the banks create the other 90% out of thin air. To reduce the amount of money in circulation, this process is simply reversed. The Federal Reserve sells these bonds to the public and the money flows out of the purchaser's local bank. Loans must be reduced by 10 times the amount of the sale, so a Federal Reserve sale of $1 million in bonds results in $10 million less money into the economy. How does this benefit the bankers whose representatives met at Jekyll Island? Number 1. It prevented any future banking reform efforts, as the Federal Reserve was to be the only producer of money. Number 2. This in turn prevented a proper debt-free system of government finance, like President Lincoln's greenbacks, from making a comeback. Instead, the bond-based system of government finance forced on Lincoln after he created greenbacks was now cast in stone. Thirdly, it benefits the bankers because it delegated to the bankers the right to create 90% of America's money supply based on a fraudulent system of fractional reserve banking and allowed them to loan out that at 90% interest. Number 4. It centralises overall control of our nation's money supply in the hands of and for the profits of a tiny cabal, the central bankers. And lastly, number 5, it established a private central bank with a high degree of independence from effective political control.